Geology isn't a real science, said one of the most distinguished scientists all around the world, the man who popularized especially quantum physics in a way that nearly nobody did, because Sheldon Cooper is always right. With one exception, because geology is a real science. But the rock is extremely boring. But the story that the rock tells is hugely interesting. It's saying our first keynote speaker of today's conference, the man who traveled the world, working for over 15 years for the BBC, creating films for communication of science. Research that is not communicated outside academia is not very useful, said the man who is telling stories that can both entertain, inform, and also make people interested in more than he is just saying, than he is just talking about. He traveled the world literally several times, but he was also locked up in an aquarium, a sealed box, for 48 hours, with just some plants to show that these plants are providing enough oxygen for him to survive. If we can make things like volcanoes and diamonds and dinosaurs exciting, then we must be doing something wrong, says our first keynote speaker who did a lot of things right. And he will share his experience. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor of Geoscience Communication and University of Plymouth, Iain Stewart. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, okay, I can multitask, I think, maybe. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the Univerzita Karlova, thank you to the Akademie, and thank you to the SciComHub as well, for inviting me here and getting to speak to an audience where I think I'm kind of half speaking to the converted, but let's see how this goes. Madam President, yeah, we met in Jordan, and you got a hint of my life that's there. I spent the last 4 years in the desert, which is always a good thing, to leave academia, to leave that safe space and go into somewhere else. And it changes your perspective on everything, and then to come back in, and I'm coming back in to the university world. And what's interesting is in the UK, science communication is a very rich ecosystem. It works at all levels. So you have academics like myself who are on television, but it goes all the way down to dance your thesis or science in the pub or all these kind of things at the student level. So going to a place like Jordan, developing country, where essentially the academic world is completely disconnected from society, from industry, from communities, from politics, was quite interesting. So one of the things I've been doing at the Royal Scientific Society, which is essentially Jordan's national academy, is trying to think about what happens if you put communication as the central engine of your organization. In other words, if you start to get everyone to think about how they communicate what they do, not just out to the public, but to each, from one department to another department, etc., trying to understand why what they do is important and what it is people should know about it. And so that's partly what I've been trying to do with Princess Samaya at the Royal Scientific Society. I wasn't going to say anything about geology, but Daniel's triggered me. So science communication for geology is pretty easy because you have amazing places. This is not in the Altiplano of Bolivia. But you have volcanoes, and you have dinosaurs, and things like earthquakes, and things that push themselves into the public kind of recognition. It's harder for some other areas of science. And so, sometimes this comes up and says, oh, well, what I work on is not very familiar to the public, and therefore it's hard to communicate. So one of the things I'm interested in is how we go to the academics that are this intellectual talent that we have in universities around the world. How can we kind of trigger them, catalyze them to communicate? And the thing with communication, anyone who's in communication will know, is for communication you have to start with who you're trying to reach. Who are they? It's them out there. It's what do they need? So in that context, I'm always interested in what the academic needs. Because academics have, wherever you go in the world, it's the same in Jordan, I'm sure it's the same here and the same in the UK, there are certain expectations of from an institution, what academics do. And so starting with them, with their needs, and then thinking about how to graft on communication onto that to enhance their offer, rather than pointing the finger at them and saying, you should do this because X, Y, or Z. So I kind of talked, maybe 5 years ago, I can't remember. 5 years ago, maybe, or so, I was here giving a talk, and I think that talk was more about communication, rah, 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 we should communicate, etc. This one is more thinking about, okay, how do we embed that in the institutional systems that we have? And how do we get the governance structures, etc.? How do we open up communications so that it's something that particularly early career, the new academics can take hold of and run with? And so that's a real challenge wherever, even in the UK, it's a real challenge. So the point I'm going to talk about is this move from simply disseminating, simply telling people what we do, which is, I think, the starting point, certainly was for me, for most academics, to move into this idea of having a public dialogue. So trying to understand who we're trying to reach and why we're trying to reach them, what do they want. And then to participation, where we're actually embedding ourselves into their worlds, not driving it from our worlds. And all of that really relates to academics having a real sense of purpose about what they want to achieve with their career, with their work. And if you know what your purpose is, it's much easier to communicate it. So a lot of my work in Jordan, a developing country, has been around risk, disaster risk, climate risk, water risk, etc. And so these are two different models of risk communication. On the left-hand side is the top-down risk management approach. And on the right is a much more bottom-up community education approach. So if we take the one on the left here, so basically there's various people talked about what's necessary, but the key things is 3 phases. There's 3 stages of risk management. So this is experts on risk trying to convey that expertise to those they think need it. So the first set of ones is just about the accuracy and integrity of the numbers. So they've done risk management, some calculations. There's a 67.3% percentage chance of probability of such and such. And it's how best to convey that 60% to the decision maker, whatever it is. And so the first one is about getting the information correct. But then there's a second phase, really, which is recognizing that you're in the persuasion business. And this is very uncomfortable for academics, that actually you think you're trying to be neutral and all the rest, but actually often you think there ought to be a response, a certain type of response from a decision maker or a community to something. You're trying to nudge them, push them towards that. So communication is a form of marketing in the sense that we're trying to nudge people to a certain behavioral change, often. And again, that is uncomfortable for academics that don't tend to be thinking that. But the last one then is moving into this idea of partnerships, that in order to affect change, you have to be connected much more deeply to the community you want to affect. And so that's about how you develop those kind of partnerships. And there's too much detail in here, but there's different models, but they all break down into those kind of three stages, if you like. But if you go to the bottom-up one, which is what the development agencies, humanitarian agencies or development agencies will do, they'll have a different thing. So one of the things they want to do is, what's the purpose of their communications? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to identify a problem? Are they trying to assess something? Are they trying to implement some kind of development plan? Are they actually looking and evaluating whether that plan was effective? They are all different dimensions of communication. And then the next bit is, well, actually, what's the best mechanism to use to do that? Is it where you can see them there? Is it a piece of theatre? Is it some videos they want to do? Is it some workshops, etc.? They're all very different communication formats. And then the last bit is, why are you doing it? What is the long-term purpose of your communication? Giving the poor a voice. Is it bringing in marginalised women and scaling up training? Why are you communicating? There's a lot of time and effort and resource going into communication. Why are you doing it? Now, what's interesting is in the development, these are competing models. So one is the expert-driven, top-down, where the scientist is kind of in charge and it's them that drives it. And the other one is very much the community. What do they need? So I just like to say that science communication offers a way of actually bridging between those two opposing, and they often are opposing views. So just a quick recap on science communication. As an academic field, most people would probably have it going back to about the 1980s when there was various kind of decisions. This had happened particularly in the UK, where people, they realized suddenly, they did surveys of the public and realized that they were scientifically illiterate. They didn't know basic facts. And this caused great furor about how can we kind of move as a modern nation when our public is so stupid of not knowing basic facts. Clearly, we need to educate them about these facts. So the big thing there was getting scientists to tell the public facts that they thought they should know, facts about gravity, about basic chemistry, etc. So this was very top down, and there was different modes of doing that. Sometimes they were entertaining, sometimes they were pure educational. But what happened was that there was this realization gradually that simply telling the facts often didn't change people's behavior. So making them aware of certain things, because we use facts in strange ways. We pick them up, we use them, we put them back down. All the facts that someone uses are different from the other facts that we use, etc. So one of the things was realizing that we needed to explain things better. So in the UK, the GM controversy was massive. So basically, we had this situation where UK scientists were greatly in favor of GM crops, but the government decided that we needed to have this consultation with the public. So there was public meetings, and you could do online surveys, and all this information get created to get put out. The public became informed. They had a kind of referendum, and the public said, we don't want it. And the scientists went crazy. They're like, well, but we've told you everything about it, so we don't want it. So there was this realization of a disconnect between the scientists just telling people things and something else was going on. So what's happened basically in science communication is it's moved from this idea of the public understanding of science, which is like, what is a hypothesis? What's a theory? How does scientists work? Peer review. Understanding the process of science. Well, that's fine. But actually, what was missing was actually this lot. What do they care about? Because that's who you have to reach. So then there was this idea of public engagement, which is, hey, we should involve them in conversations and get to know them a little bit better. But I think the motivation for that was still, if we know them better, we can target our messages better. Pure marketing, So if we know they're interested in that, then if we talk about it that way, that lot will accept what we say. And so we'll end up today across here at this space for a lot of the science communication about participation, which is about co-design, co-production. So really working at, thinking about who you're trying to reach and then working with them to kind of pervade science into their world. And one of the nice phrases that gets used now is allowing a social conversation about science. So that you've been successful if when you leave the room, the end user community is talking about science, that you're not driving it. You've just kind of motivated it. So the point is there that scientists and science communication have moved from this dissemination. So the deficit model refers to the fact that the assumption is that the reason people don't follow the science is they don't have enough information. They have a knowledge deficit. So if we fill that deficit with information, then they'll think like us. And we know that from empirical evidence for the last 40 years, it isn't true. So as we move through, we then have to kind of go on this journey. And I think this journey is a journey, this is what I'm talking about purpose. Why are you doing what you're doing? So this graph really talks to the vertical axis is the motivation or the sense of purpose of a scientist. So why are you doing it? Are you just interested in pure knowledge for the sake of just curiosity, blue skies? Or are you driven by solving very, kind of societal problems that are given to you? And then along here is how much is the external audience, whoever it is, decision makers or the public or a community or business leaders, how much are they involved in the process of the research of the science? And so, in my view, and this was probably for me, and it may not be for everyone, most academics start down here. They've done their PhD, and that's what they've got expertise in. And then when they go into postdoc, etc., that's of course what they're thinking about. That's their network, and so they start to evolve. And really, it's not really driven by any much thought of external perception or whatever it is. But then if they get interested in science communication, they then tend to drift, and I think they drift up in this way. So down here is the idea of, I want to tell people about what I know, because I find it so fascinating what I'm interested in. I want more people to know about it. So that's dissemination. That's about being a better communicator of what you know. But then there's these other kind of domains, if you like, that are lying out there that I don't think we utilize as much. So one is recognizing that we're trying to persuade people for certain behavioral changes around whatever we work on. If you work on AI, I know people in the room are working on AI, or whether it's on disaster risk or climate change, adaptation, whatever it is, we're expecting people to move in a particular direction, informed by the science. And then as we drift into this one, then it's much more of like you end up in a kind of social learning space where it's really about the end user community and what they want from you as a scientist, not what you're giving them. So this was certainly the way that I've gone, and most of my recent work in Jordan has been working with communities in Eastern Jordan, trying to understand them and trying to build a science in. So. But where I started was dissemination, has been mentioned. Pure dissemination, like making television programs that go out on mainly our second channel, and BBC Two. No attempt at feedback. Public have no input into the programs. They don't send any information back. You get reviews and things like that, but there's not really an interaction. So really, and as Daniel mentioned, really focusing around the planet and different aspects about the planet for the last few years. But it's increasingly getting into particularly more societal things. The fracking was big, and then oil, energy. And so trying to think about societal driven concerns more towards the end. So what I thought I'd do is just say some of the things that I think came out of trying to popularize earth science, geoscience, that I think are generic. In other words, they work across all sciences. I think they work probably across all modes of communication as well, whether you're trying to do a tweet or whether you're trying to do a YouTube video, or whatever it is if you're writing a book. So one of them is about awe and wonder. So psychologists actually have measured awe and wonder. It's an element that you can actually empirically look at. What is it that makes people go, oh? What is it that takes people out of their everyday experience of going to work and things like that, and reading the paper, and then reading some little thing that says, oh my gosh, I did not know that. That's amazing. And I think we've all got it in our own sciences it's probably the thing that got us in to the science in the first place, was that sense of awe and wonder about something. It might be very distant to what you're working on now, but something, in fact, what you're working on now, if you told your 17-year-old self about it, they'd probably say, that sounds really boring. And now, of course, it's fascinating for you. So you have to think about that. So anyway, this happens to be the Crystal Cave in northern Mexico. Amazing place. For the geologists in the audience, is there any geologists in the audience? That's okay, I can say whatever I want. These are gypsum crystals, calcium sulfate, the most basic crystal, one of the most basic ones, but extraordinary. It looks amazing. So people go, oh, you've taken them out of where they are, and they're suddenly interested in something. The next one is make it about people. This image is the opening shot in a BBC Horizon, which is used to be it's kind of finished now, but it used to be the only scheduled science program, science series on television, British television. And they asked me to do something on sinkholes, and I said, well, there's nothing new science on sinkholes, not really that interested. And they said, no, we really, really like to do it. And the thing that caught my attention was that in Florida, just the year before, there had been the first death of someone that was swallowed by a sinkhole. And what I was really interested at that time was disasters and the human anatomy of disasters and things, so I did it. But it's the human story of this guy, Jeb Bush, who lost his brother, Jeff Bush, in this sinkhole that kind of drives the motivation of that whole story about it. And this is a quote that really from Ted Neild, who's the journalist in this paper we wrote. And he said, it's a fact often overlooked by scientists that most other people are mostly interested in other people. And they're mostly not interested in anything else. The fact that scientists are more interested in average in things and ideas marks them out, marks me out, marks you out, maybe, as mentally unusual. So people are interested in people. And so getting people into your stories, into your science becomes really important. One of the obvious people is yourself, as the researchers. And that is deeply uncomfortable for many academics because we don't exist. You know, if you write your academic paper, you do not exist in that paper. It doesn't say, I climbed up this hill and I did this. And no, the samples were taken from the top of the hill, magically. They were moved to the lab. Analysis was undertaken. By who, what day, were you feeling good? You know, that kind of thing. There's no humanity in that story. For good reason, because then the shift of focus is on you rather than on the science. And science should be, the same experiment should be run several times to get the same result. It shouldn't matter who the investigator is. So for science, that works. But for communication, it's lousy because people are interested in people. So you become the interesting one. And Daniel actually referenced this one. This was when I was locked in an airtight box for 2 days. Oxygen levels were reduced from 21% down to 12%. And then I was put in. And of course, I was going to use up more oxygen. So if I just kept on going like that, I would go into hypoxia, etc. But we also put in there a whole bunch of high photosynthesizing plants to pump out, to take in my CO2 and pump out oxygen. And this was the experiment. It's a Joseph Priestley experiment from the 18th century. But the reason we did it was because there's lots of ways of talking about photosynthesis. There's various ways, but actually having some kind of experience that shows, for example, that set of plants that's in there is what barely keeps me alive. I could show you the results. We even got a scientific paper out of it as a result. But you can tell the oxygen levels went back up. I mean, I'm here. But the interesting point was, I basically did nothing for 2 days, and that is all of the plants that just kept me going. So these kind of things add a dimension which you don't get when you do a scientific explanation of photosynthesis, the experiential, the immersive context of having someone in that position. And so often what will happen when you go to talk to journalists and media is they're as interested or more interested in you than they are of your science. Because the science is quite distant to them, but you're right in front of them, and you're interesting because you're studying this. So they'll often ask you, why do you do that? What was your background, etc. And at first you're going, oh, no, it's not about me, it's about the science. But you're the gateway, you're the portal into the science. You're the way that helps both the journalist and the public beyond to come into your science by being that. And again, some like that and some don't. What I find is that some of the younger academics think that's fine, perfectly fine, and a lot of the older academics and professors are very uncomfortable about doing that. And so I think there is a kind of an aspect of it, the traditional conservative way that we've done this in the past getting in the way. But anyway, make it about you. And then make it about what people are interested in. People are generally not talking about science out there on the streets. But when they do talk about those science issues, that's a time when a little window opens and you can be having those kind of conversations. And if that window doesn't open, then finding ways to open that window yourself by connecting to things that people care about becomes critical. So that's why that understanding of the public, of your audience, becomes essential, because you have to know what they're interested in to connect with them. So this is the classic way we do science. So as a scientist, you come in, you learn lots of facts at undergraduate and a master's and PhD, and gradually you yourself, you start to refine and focus down on the things you're interested in, becomes ever more detailed, and you end up in that sharp point there, and you've written a paper or a report and you want to communicate it. Well, the public are at that point. As you approach them and they go, oh, why are you even telling me this? What has this got to do with me? Why should I even give you 5 minutes of my time to you? If you can't find a way to connect in that instant, there is no communication. It just stops. So, but if you can connect with them, so, well, it's actually to do with this. Okay. You can actually draw them potentially in deeper and deeper into quite detailed conversations that, about what you do. But it's about flipping the traditional approach. It's not that, I just highlight, it's not that this approach is wrong. It works for science, probably. It just doesn't work for communication. So thinking about your communication as, I can do it in 2 modes and I can jump between 2 modes, that becomes a real skill set that I think. So it's not about abandoning the scientific methodology way. And then the last one, and probably the most important one, is don't make it about those facts. Make it about stories. Facts, it's not that facts aren't important, they're critically important. It's just they're boring. They're not very interesting. But if you have a story that's interesting, almost by definition, you have to scaffold it with facts. There has to be some kind of elements in there that kind of structure your story. But because you've told it as a story, people will remember it, and they'll probably remember the facts that go towards creating and scaffolding that story. This is from 2 climate scientists that was published in Physics Today, and I think it's probably the best succinct summary of science communications. Try to craft messages that are simple and memorable. Repeat them. Make effective use of imagery, metaphor, narrative. And then the critical bit. Be a better storyteller. Lead with what you know, in other words, what you've got some expertise in, and let your passion show. And I don't think we tell that enough to students about the passion show. And maybe even as academics, narrow-road academics, we've forgotten a little bit about that passion of why we got into it. But that idea of passion is like a drug for communication. If you have passion, enthusiasm, people feed off of it. So I just want to push on a little bit more with this idea of storytelling, because I think it's a really important way to connect with those academics that think, actually, I'm not sure communication's really for me because I don't really like public speaking, I don't really like, or I'm too busy, whatever. Storytelling is a fundamental skill. So if you go into any bookshop, I don't know, in your head, think of the science area that you work on, and then think of going into the bookshop and asking the person in the bookshop to, where is the section that has, well, for me it would be geoscience, for you it would be something different. For me, if the person even understands what I said, geoscience, they'll probably go, oh, we don't have anything on that. Or they'll direct me down to maybe somewhere down there, maybe if I'm lucky, and there might be 2 books actually on that thing. And at first you get, oh, it's quite depressing, isn't it? But this is really interesting, because that bookshop, wherever you are, is the public's mind. You're in the public's head. This is what they spend their money on. This is what they're interested in. So take another look at that bookshop. What is in that bookshop if it's not science? There'll be a little bit of popular science probably somewhere. Almost certainly history, huge sections maybe on history. War history particularly often gets a big chunk of the space, but general history. Art, cooking, travel, biography. These are all the things that the public care about. So if you can bend your science into some of those areas, then you're much more likely to get people to pick up on it because they're genuinely interested in it. And then you take them into the sciencey bit of that. So the bookstores are really a good reminder of this. But half of that bookstore is fiction. It's stories, which tells you something more important, which is that people like stories. They like to read stories of. And because of that, there's certain expectations. So this is a paper in PNAS from, it's about 10 years ago now, I think. And empirically reviewing what we know about narrative formats and communication. And basically the message is, if you convey your science in a narrative format, it connects much more easily to other audience. But especially if it's complex material you're trying to get across. Embedding it in a narrative format is much more effective to increase comprehension, interest, and engagement. The second thing is, even if you're not going to do that, and even if you're not going to go public, and your chances are you're going to integrate with your PR team, your marketing team, your external relations team at your organization, or with journalists, and the mediators, essentially. And they're embedded in narratives They want to tell stories. So understanding how to tell a story makes you better to connect internally in your organization with the people who are going to be sending this stuff out. In fact, the last point, the point they make in the paper is narratives are so powerful, so persuasive, that we need to be careful how we use them. So I'm sure we all can think of people with very strong stories about how things work that are complete rubbish in terms of science, but they're just accepted because they're amazing storytellers, a very powerful way. So it's a skill set we have to be careful with, but the idea is if we just start to understand storytelling a little bit better, we can be much more effective and compelling in our ways. So there is a science to storytelling. And really, this was Freytag working in the late 19th century that has got kind of the first scientific framework for how stories are. He looked at European myths and he kind of summarized the elements of them. And it's he basically says, look, the start of a story is an exposition. You set it up somewhere. There's a setup that feels familiar. People recognize that world. And then you disrupt that world with an inciting incident, something that fragments it, disrupts it in some way, and then you're off. You're off on your story. And in the first part of your story, what he called the rising action, you've got your protagonists or your protagonists that are kind of reacting to the situations that are imposed on them. But in that process, they get gradually or suddenly transformed and suddenly have a different perspective on the world. And then there's another set of falling action where in that transformed state, they then start to look at the world in a more purposeful way. That then leads to a resolution and finally to a climax, and everything is wrapped up at the end. So that's essentially the essential elements of a story. It's been worked on lots more by storytellers and storytelling academics. This is Robert McKee, who is a professor of screenwriting at the University of California and who used to run these like 3-day workshops for wannabe Hollywood screenwriters to say, this is how you tell stories, where they show loads of movies, Titanic, Jaws, whatever, Star Wars, and talk about the storytelling narratives, etc. When I worked at the BBC Horizon used to send most of their series producers, their mainly producers, on his course to take the idea of how Hollywood would script the thing and put it onto a science show, which worked for a while, but we can talk more about why it's not continued to this day. But certainly when I was working for him, storytelling, narrative structure, the 3-act structure of Robert McKee was the basic template, which was a little bit more complicated, but basically had a setup, a confrontation, and a resolution. There was this Act 1, which the setup with the inciting incident led to a climax. Then there was this ascending action type of thing. His big argument was you had to have a twist somewhere in the middle because that was quite a long section. You had a little twist. But it was the same thing. You end up with a resolution and everything's all tied off really nicely. And I'm sure you can all think, there's a little bloke, he's in a village, he finds a ring, but at first he doesn't want to have anything to do with it. No, not me, blah, blah, blah. And then some sort of strange man with a long beard comes to his house and says, no, you should do it, and this ring's important. And off he goes on this journey. And at first it's reactive, but then he realizes that he has to do something, he gets purpose, and he finishes it, and of course that's Lord of the Rings. And you can play this again and again and again. Thank you for that. So the point was that I think there's an overlap between the way that we think of that storytelling and the science paper. So if you think about it in the science paper here, the setup is us saying what the context is. That first section of the paper really is to have a familiar setting that someone reading the paper will go, oh yeah, I understand this. This is my world. This is the world we operate in. And then the end of that introduction, there'll be but here's the problem. This is the problem we're facing. We don't know this or we don't know that. So there's then a way, then the adventure then is to say, well, what is the way around that? You start to say, I've got this new machine, or I've got this new outcrop, or this section, or I've got this new conceptual framework. And that's going to allow me to look at that problem in a very different way, and I'm going to collect some data, and I'm going to analyze that data, and here's the results. And then that's the end is the main findings. And of course, the main findings, the world is now transformed. because you have this new perspective or equipment. And in that transformer, you can look again back at the problem and have that discussion and conclusions about how the world is different. And it all gets wrapped up. Finally, where you say, it's all fine. Well, there's a few things we need to look at, because that's going to be your next grant proposal. That's going to be the next bit of funding you want, because you've set up this thing about the call to arms that's going to kind of finish off. So it doesn't, and I think it works for a research proposal as well, you know, setting these things up. So thinking of slightly reframing, just a quarter twist, not a complete thing, reframing the way you think about it is what is my, where's the points of tension, of drama in my story, even if it's something that seems very mundane because it's a piece of science writing. And I think you can do that. And anyone who's here that's been served on evaluation panels, research evaluation panels, knows that around that table, there's maybe one or two people actually know technically what you're talking about. The rest of them don't. But they've all usually got equal weight in the proposal. So you'll find that if you write it as more compelling in a story, that some of those other people will say, I like that proposal. I don't know why. I just liked it. I just thought it flowed nicely. Blah, blah, blah. And suddenly, you know, around that table, you've got a lot of nods and people are sitting going, I really like that. I think that's great. So I think that it's in these quite subtle shifts that I think storytelling can help us just as academics. This is an interesting one because this is Nancy Duarte was one of the people who started TED Talks. And she's given a TED Talk on how to do a TED Talk. And what's interesting about TED Talks, of course, is they're, 15 minutes, 17 minutes, 20 minutes? Not probably the same length as an academic conference paper. But, I mean, it's a similar thing. It's a 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. It's been the same since Aristotle 2,000 years ago. But she then starts with, you know, so again, you start with the world as it is, whatever your world is, as is. And then you have an inciting incident. You say, but what if we did this? And you take them off to a different place. But in this one, you always drop in back into your audience because your audience is maybe still not that convinced. And it's a series of what ifs. Yeah, but you're probably thinking, what if? You're probably thinking, and finishes with this big call to action, big inspirational finish that says, so this is what we want to do, and here's how we're going to do it. And so I think, again, thinking of slightly recasting some of our conference papers in this way actually makes you much more effective at reaching a broader audience. So I just wanted to finish with this one because it's quite a complicated one, but the point that I want to make is that this is my mental swirl about communication, which is that it starts with dissemination and being better at disseminating what you know, and there's various communication devices that do it, but you're still essentially sending out information that you think is important to an audience that doesn't necessarily think it's that important. So there, I think the storytelling is using the storytelling to be a better communicator. But I just wanted to flag this business about these other modes, really, because I think as you go up around here, as you get into this area, you start to realize that you need to know your audience better, and there's various ways of knowing that. Almost all of them come from the social sciences and the humanities. So one of the things is that moving through the communication is that if someone in the physical sciences and natural sciences, understanding the science of communication as shown by anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists, etc., is a really important thing. There's tons of science, grounded science, empirical studies on what works, and yet we often just put our finger in the air and just do something and say, oh yeah, people liked it, that was really good. So we should be more scientific about our science communication, and part of that is this dialogue phase. But the thing that I'm really learning out in Jordan is there's a community storytelling. It's how do we capture and curate the stories from the audience that we have? How do we get them to tell us their stories so that we can use that? And that's a whole bunch of different types of interactions and engagements and skill sets. But they all really lead to increasing the levels of partnership and participation by the outside group. And so for me, just setting that in that broader context, and my feeling is that in universities, we can kind of go on that journey. That the starting point is probably to be introducing our academic, technical experts to this idea of just being a better communicator and storytelling, etc. And some of them will get into that and get really like it. And you can start to lure them into the darker areas of the social sciences then and start to say, well, actually, you can get more from understanding the human science and the mind sciences, essentially. And if they get into that, then they start to realize, hold on, I can be even more effective for this community if I really understand them and work with them. And that's now, I'd have to say, this bit is very easy, fairly easy. It doesn't take that much money. I mean, we could have made a video now, and I could have put it out. Well, it's getting streamed. But you can do it pretty easily. It doesn't take much time. You can build it into your projects. As you move around that swirl, the stuff on the left-hand side, it takes a long time. I've been working 4 years, more or less, in the same community, and nothing's written up yet. So it's still a long process. And that doesn't fit with research grants that tend to be 3 years or 4 years, etc. So participatory work, that other end of the spectrum, really needs a bigger team, multi-team, and probably longer, something where you're saying, this is going to take us 10 years, maybe, to do this properly. So that's an imposition. But the main thing, I think, this is my final slide, is that I think the thing that drives you around that swirl, I think increasingly, will be you as an individual saying, what do I want to use this for? So I see communication as a fundamental part of the academic toolkit. It's not something we just do on our weekends or after work because it makes us feel good and then we go back to the boring stuff. It is something that is inherently part of the research process and as part of the academic output kind of process. And by purpose, I use a definition of purpose that business uses. So purposeful businesses, social businesses, things like your Patagonias, your Ben & Jerry's, etc. These things. They've got the pursuit of an ambitious, clear, enduring, and overarching goal which is motivating. Motivating to you and motivating to those around you. A real sense of where you're going with your academic work and how communication helps you. And that's why I refer to it as this idea of strategic science communication. If you're going to spend time doing this, if it's going to be important to you, you need to put you and those around you, in other words, your department, your institution, need to put resources your way to help you develop that. And by doing that, you can be much more purposeful, both for you and for them. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iain. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. Thank you very much for showing this magnificent picture of you holding the Earth. How did you take this picture?
So we've got an immersive vision theatre at Plymouth, which is a great projection thing. And and we took it in there, and it's a white disc I'm holding, of course, and then they've photoshopped the Earth on top of it. So I'm not really holding the Earth. Amazing.
Just metaphorically,
yeah, metaphorically, exactly.
But it's a way for communication of science. It's much easier for us to help us with technology.
Images are important. I try to use images, and said it in the top. A dramatic image. One thing we often, researchers often get told, young PhD students get told, well, your last slide is to say thank you and have all your list of, who has helped you and all your sponsors up. It's a very boring way to end. An important image with your key message is a much more effective thing.
If you have any questions, please just raise your hand. We will provide you with the microphone, and we will also use the questions that are arriving via Slido. You can use the hashtag Komunikace, vědy to ask your questions. We will get to you in a moment's time. I will start with the storytelling that you mentioned as the most important thing. Because you skipped one important thing that you are always stressing out. Okay. What needs to happen in the first 5 minutes of the film that you are preparing?
So we have this thing, the pre-title. So you can imagine, particularly for television, so our program's going out 8 o'clock at night or something. So people have had their tea, their dinner, they're sitting, they've got the remote and they're moving through the channels. And geology is not the most immediate thing that people have. So that pre-title, which is 2 or 3 minutes, is the absolute key to get people to watch. And there's various kind of tricks to do it. It's the same as the hook for a journalist. I'm sure, Andrew, you know this very well. It's very hard. There was once I did a show called Men of Rock, which was about the Scottish pioneers of geology. So that's quite a niche thing, there's not that many people watch it. And I couldn't actually make it I mean, I was on a train going past, so I had to watch it on Twitter as it was then. And so it came on. And one of the ones said, hey, go and watch this Men of Rock. And then that was it. And then I was looking through. And then the next one was, this Men of Rock's all about geology. I thought it was about Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and things like that. So that was fine. And then there's more tweets. And then like 5 minutes later, this person says, actually, this thing on geology is quite interesting. So that was great, because that was someone who did not expect that, thought negatively, and watched. So there's very rare times you actually see that pre-title working. But the first few minutes, that it's the key. And I think it is in anything, you know, giving a talk or something. You have to capture people by showing it how it's relevant to their, invading their world somehow and grabbing them.
Yeah, they're making the decision if they are staying with you or not.
So, yeah.
In BBC Horizon, you have a little bit more time than you have, for example, in your Instagram stories. Because in your Instagram stories, you have 0.3 to 0.8 seconds to persuade them to stay with you and to give you the attention.
Yeah, but I show it. I mean, the trouble with the Horizon, it's 60 minutes. That's a lot of someone's time. So someone's trying to decide whether to give 60 minutes of their life to you to watch that show. And often when I talk about the importance of that, and I'm glad you remind me, I show the only Horizon that won a British Academy Film and Television Award, BAFTA, is a show called Fermat's Last Theorem. And it's about an obscure piece of mathematics. So not the type of thing that's going to make, but it was hugely successful and hugely popular. And the pre-title there is the camera going into the office of this mathematician with paper everywhere, you know, absolutely everywhere. And this very geeky guy, Andrew Wilde, sitting there. Almost every ingredient would not be something you would watch for 60 minutes. And he starts talking about what he's discovered. And he starts to cry, and it stops. And of course you watch, because you're thinking, why is he crying? You know, it's a very emotional thing, so yeah.
But there is something even more powerful concerning the topic. You mentioned that in your talk in Australia in 2014. Last year I did a Horizon on fracking, which arguably was, in terms of the planet, one of the issues of the day. I got 1.9 million viewers. The previous week Horizon got 5.5 million viewers. What was it about?
Daniel, you're so good. I love how it's scary how much research he does. Yeah, the previous one was on cats and where your cat goes at night.
Yes.
So I did something on it, which at the time was what people were arguing about in pubs and cafes and things like that. It's fracking business and things like that. And people often have a go at Horizon because they say, so as I said, it's been less successful in more recent years, and ratings and viewing figures have gone down. And people say that's because it's dumbed down. What we need is more strong science in there. That's what we do. And that's the example I use to counter that. Say, I did something on fracking, 1.5 million. The week before, 5.5 million people watched Where Your Cat Goes at Night. So I don't think it's about a desire to have more science in there. It's about more connection with what they're interested in.
We have the first question from the audience, please.
Julie Novaková, Institute of Physics. Thank you for a great talk. And regarding the power of awe and wonder and the place that fiction accompanies in people's mind and the power of storytelling, one way to use all of this is to engage with popular culture, to use comic books, science fiction, etc. What do you think of this approach, its risks and benefits, and some good and bad examples?
Well, I think what's fantastic about science communication is it's so broad. You know, you can do music, theatre, poetry, graphics. And, you know, not everyone likes to stand up and do public talks. You can do gamification, video games and things like that. Video games and interactive is going to be a massive lot of things. So there's kind of like a space for everyone. And equally, each of those avenues takes you to a slightly different demographic or a different public. So I think it's great. And I think that really showcasing the diversity, because I said, you know, I showed about the journey of academics. And generally, the academic that decides they want to do some public communication, and usually it's increasingly getting done from the research funders who say, what's your dissemination thing? And they say, well, I'm going to do a public talk, or I'm going to have a web page, or I'm going to write a popular article. It's kind of like a dipping the toe in the water. But I think the new stuff that's coming out is going to blow all that away. You should be much more imaginative ways, because you should be thinking about who your audience is. You know, is that audience going to go to, you know, give a public talk? If I give a public talk, this is a good example. It's already a pro-science group that comes to see that talk. It's not reaching out to these audiences that don't think science, it serves them well, etc., that we're often worried about. So I think finding ways to connect to the audience, and that's a great way.
So if you do not know to whom you are talking to, you are with nearly 100% certainty talking in a wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, we like to talk to ourselves in the public. So if you have and I'll use my university as a good example. We'll often put on a public talks program. It's the same people that turn up every week to that, and it's a very familiar, safe audience to do. And it's good reaction, and we feel we've done some. We've talked to the public, but there's a whole bunch of people out in that broader community around my city that would never even dream of coming to the university to listen to a public talk. But they've still got opinions, and they vote and all of this stuff. So how do we? Is it important to reach them? That's the first question. If it is, it's probably not a public talk in the university that's going to do it.
Concerning the comic books, you have mentioned James Kakalios, the American physicist. It's one of the examples how to use superheroes. You're a fan of his. You're a fan of James Kakalios. You met him. Read all the books and the thousands of comics books he has at home, and his wives hate it. He created a book, for example, called Physics of Superheroes, explaining physics using just superheroes.
Wow.
That's really cool, honestly.
Yeah, it's very cool.
What should universities do to support their students in science communications? Luce Valova is asking. The role of universities.
How long have you got? Okay, so I think there's a mindset / cultural regime change, or a mindset change or regime change that needs to think in universities. So universities have really always thought of themselves as these bastions of knowledge acquisition, that they curate knowledge. And the idea of communicating out that knowledge has been a secondary element. And the assumption has been that the communication is through research articles and all the ways that we tend to get evaluated. So that's the system that most academics have grown up in and worked to. And so they work to that system, you know. So it's trying to get your H-index up, trying to get citations, getting the best journals, et cetera, et cetera. But increasingly, I think, universities themselves are finding them that they have to justify themselves to the outside world, to the people who fund them, to the government, to the public, et cetera. And simply saying, well, we published a really high-cited paper in science doesn't really do it for any of those groups. So we're struggling in the UK now around funding, and I no idea. You know, money's tight around the world. I'm sure it's the same in the Czech Republic. So I think that one of the things is universities showing that what they do is useful is going to be increasingly important. The universities that can demonstrate we do good science, but that science has a meaningful effect to the end user, to our communities, and showing that, communicating that in a certain way. And it will not be through academic papers they do that. So at the moment, in most academic systems, that doesn't get incentivized. So academics who are interested in that are forced to do it in their spare time, or not do it at all, or do it at the expense of promotions, because the promotion system says it's about a bunch of criteria that have got nothing to do with it. So one is really the executive level of the university thinking, how do we incentivize this? Because this will bring a benefit to our institution. Having our academics out there talking about how, this university or that university is doing good things for society will bring actually a monetary value in the end, but also reputational value. So that's something that can only happen at the governance level. But there also has to be a kind of community of practice low down, because communications are very, if you think about imposter syndrome, almost all science communication have a huge dose of imposter syndrome, because communication is so varied. So you kind of need a support system around you as well that says, yes, this is good, keep going, this is great. And the two then need to connect. So there's a top-down element that has to happen, and probably has to be driven by money. If the university or you're not going to get money in some way, directly or indirectly, it's probably going to be hard to sustain it. But the other one is having a support system of encouragement around you. And both of them are relatively easy to do, actually. So it just needs that push, crossing that tipping point. And events like this will be critical, I think.
I'm Googling Lucia Valova to make sure that she's the one that I thought she was. She's the one who is working on FameLab in the Czech Republic, who works on the long life education methods that are prepared by the Charles University. But I would like to take your answer and put it to the ground to a scientist.
Yeah.
We have a scientist that is working at the university and is approached by a journalist asking him or her for an interview, for a 25-minute long interview. What should the university provide before this interview to the scientist?
That's a good point. I mean, I'm assuming this academic is not very experienced with the media because you're asking that
just
question.
Immediate,
so maybe the first approach. Usually the first approach is quite funny. The first approach to the academics to sort of rise up a little bit because the media is suddenly interested and thinking, this is great. 30 years have been ignored is now over, and here's my moment. And so they'll be telling this person on the phone lots of things. Well, I first started here, and then I did this, and I did this. And, of course, this journalist at the other end is going crazy because they've asked for a particular story or a particular point. And so usually the response from the journalist pointing this out is met with annoyance because this person's whole career is they want to talk about it, and this journalist is interested in this tiny little thing. But I think there's an element of media literacy, and I think it's about us as academics understanding what the role of the journalist is and more interaction with journalists. So the first thing to ask, I think, is what's your story? What's your angle? Almost certainly that journalist is approaching you with a kind of scaffolded story in their head that they're thinking of writing. There's probably a lot of errors in that. And the academic, first of all, picks up on the errors and goes, oh, this journalist doesn't know what they're talking about. They didn't know this, they didn't know this, they didn't know this. And so their first bit is the deficit model to correct these errors. But the more important bit is, why are you writing this story and what is it you want from me? And if there's that honesty between... And I find I've not really had any bad experiences with journalists. I find there is an honesty there. It's often, if it goes bad, it's because of people not understanding each other. So asking, what's your story? Why are you interested in that? Why are you doing that story? Okay, you're coming out from that angle. Well, I don't actually agree with that, but let me help you because I think there's this group over here who do agree with that. But do you know what I mean? You start a conversation.
So you're pre-interviewing. As the member of the faculty, let's say, the scientist who will be on TV, to make sure that you shape the ideas and formulations and the story for the interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a relationship. Both of you, the journalist wants to get it right. It's the cliche of the journalist trying to catch it, I just don't see as real. The journalist wants to get it right. They don't want to be embarrassed by wrong things. They want to get it read. They want to get it through their editor, who is probably not very interested in that story, and so that's the big thing. So they have to get these things all in place for the story even to arise. So the academics shouldn't be making it more difficult. You should be saying, well, how can I help you? That's really the key.
Who should do the research on the interviewer and on the program that the scientist is taking part in? The faculty, the scientist himself, herself?
So it's an interesting one. I think that often PR teams and universities, they're there as a protective measure often for the academic. So they'll sometimes say, oh, this one is really good, or this one's not so good. And they'll sometimes train the academics to answer in certain ways. The trouble with that is it gets quite defensive. You're always worried you're going to get catched out. You're worried about the institutional repute if you say something wrong. My feeling is it's a human-to-human relationship, and you're speaking to that journalist, and there's an element of trust. Now, trust... you can look at things. There are journalists and media outlets that you trust more, but I think it's about having an implicit trust in the relationship until it's shown not to be trustworthy.
So talk it out in advance. Talk it out, ask questions. Do not hesitate to ask the questions repeatedly to make sure that you got it right.
Yeah, and I think this, exactly.
Could anyone be a good science communicator, or do they need an X factor?
I think anyone can be a communicator. I was just saying that. Like I ran a science communication master's course at our place, and I had one student who would hardly say anything, would be quiet all the time, and we had 10 weeks. And then at the end, he said, "I'm going to do a master's in science communication." I went, "Oh my God!" And he said, "Because I'm really interested in video games." And suddenly I thought, of course, that's perfect. If he sits making video games and doing that, that's brilliant. He doesn't want to be up speaking. He hates it, So I think anyone could do it. I think training is useful. It gives you that scaffolding. You know, there are certain tricks and devices you can do. And media training is useful as long as it's not too much of this defensive posturing. So you can absolutely get better at it. But I think there's, you know, everyone has got in them that ability to communicate. I would say in all of our universities, there's usually a few people you look at and you think, I don't want that person going anywhere near the public. But, you know, that's a minority, a tiny minority. I think most people, if you want to do it, you should do it. And you'll find your own way through. You know? So
you shouldn't beat yourself up when you are not strong in public speaking because you can write.
No, or writing. I mean, I'm better at public speaking than I am in the writing. I enjoy the writing, but it's more of a labour. Other people are amazing at the writing and they hate the public speaking. You know, there's some really interesting science writers who have never transferred onto the, you know, television and things like that because it's not their medium. You know?
How should a scientist communicate doubts and uncertainties to the public?
Well, that's an interesting one because we say all the thing, the trouble with the public is they don't understand risk and uncertainty. And I say, well, actually, the trouble is it's a scientist that doesn't understand risk and uncertainty because we've turned uncertainty and risk into this probabilistic set of numbers that we then compute and calculate, and then we struggle to think how to convey those numbers. But the public don't think about that uncertainty in that way. They think in a much more intuitive way. They use a different language for it. And this was brought home. I was taking my daughter to school, and we were kind of crossing this road, and so I was saying to, you know, there's a long street that comes down from our house and loops up, and then the bus stops here. And so I was saying, so what you need to do, darling, is you need to look to see if there's any cars coming. If there's any cars coming, you don't cross, but there are no cars coming, you cross. And I looked, and it was absolutely fine. And I said, so what should we do? And she said, no, don't cross. And I said, what do you mean? Well, there's a car coming. I said, what? Right in the distance, a car had just turned the corner and was coming down. I saw it, but I knew it was, intuitively, I knew it was not a problem. It's too far away. She looked at it and thought, I've been told that, therefore it's a thing. So we internalize uncertainty and risk all the way. So again, and always it comes down to having a conversation with the people. So they can surface. We were doing a geothermal project in southwest England. And some of the objections to the geothermal project was we were drilling into the granite, which was 250 million euro granite. And they were worried that the magma was going to burst out, which was laughable for a geologist because it was very old and it was solidified and all the rest of it. But the point was that they knew that the granite was once molten and that we were looking for hot rocks. So the only thing that was ridiculous is that they didn't know the melting temperature of granite. Now, if I asked you the melting temperature of granite, there'd be a good reason for you not knowing it either. So it wasn't a crazy thing. But at the end of the day, it was making them say, no, I object to this engineering project because it might have this effect. So I think conversations are ways of disarming that a little bit more. And also, you know, saying, well, actually, you know, as a scientist, this is what worries me. This is what I'm worried about in the uncertainties. And then, and so sharing that kind of back and forth, that your uncertainties, what you worry about, is maybe different to theirs, and they starting to realize that you're taking this seriously and you think about it.
So talk about it honestly, but not exaggerating the risk, just pointing out what the probabilities are.
Yeah, it's easy to say, but almost everyone comes from organizations or companies, and you being uber honest can cause problems. And this is another thing I think is really important, is your organization needs to have your back if you go out there and you get it wrong. You're going to make mistakes and uncertainties. So if you go around and go, yeah, I'm worried about that too, and suddenly that's the headline in the newspaper the next day, and you're getting the call from your boss or from the president saying, what on earth are you doing? You've really caused us a problem here. You know, that's a learning process. So I think, you know, there will be times when it gets wrong, and I think there needs to be, that's where the support system's key.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for an amazing talk. And I would like to comment something a little bit, for you to comment a little bit about that involving of the public into the scientific discussions. Because for me, it's a really great idea, but I see two challenges. First, a ratio of scientists who would do science communication and amount of people in public. And second, as it is a little bit challenging for scientists to go into this direction, it is also somehow challenging maybe for a public, you know.
Yeah.
Because many people just want to sit down, listen, nice talk, say, wow, it was interesting, and go home.
Yeah.
And you have to go out of your shell to actually consult with scientists and be part of the process.
Yeah.
So if you have some ideas and approach how to address those challenges.
Well, it's interesting because I think I mentioned that participation side is what I'm just getting into, so I'm encountering exactly these problems. The first bit, I think, is a little bit easier. I think my sense is that swirl, if scientists can start on that journey, it is a kind of slow process. It's confidence building. Then you can take them into them feeling a little bit about that they've got the right toolkit to start thinking about the public. What's interesting is the skill set is there. It's about media literacy, understanding media journalism, science journalism, the kind of thing that Daniel's so good at. All of that stuff comes in there. Actually, the next bit as well is what Daniel's good at. But the other side around the participation is facilitation, conciliation, negotiation. They're completely different skill sets that wouldn't normally be taught together. So if you do a science communication course or a media training, you'll get all of the first stuff, but the other set of skills are different. So there's a skill building. I think from the community side about it, that's a little bit trickier because when I work in Jordan, a lot of the communities, they sit there and they go, well, you're the expert, so you're telling us. They're just ready to sit there and follow. So when you turn around and you say, no, what are you interested in? It's quite hard to get them to say what they're doing. So that's a long process. But the key still is, what did they care about? So, for example, the community that I'm working on has got a real problem with water and water scarcity. When I talk to them, though, they don't have a hospital. And they don't have a higher education place. So when I say, oh, we could do this, they say, is that going to get us a hospital? And you go, oh, is it going to get them a hospital? I don't know. So you kind of work through. So eventually you get to this thing where you say, no, but if we raise the profile of the town, we raise it up in the national consciousness, then that idea of them saying, hold on, they don't even have a hospital. It's a long game thing. But I think the critical thing is always that conversation. Who are they? What do they care about? And then that's your way in. And as I say, it's not very conducive to the research grants. It's 2 years or 3 years, and you have to say in advance what you're going to do because you don't know what the community are interested in. You have to just go ahead and do it. And it takes a lot of resource, a lot of time. So it's not easy.
Susanna, are you satisfied with the answer? Okay.
Phew.
Phew. Do you have any advice on how to communicate science to people who are exposed to a lot of disinformation? So actually, anybody. I believe it is a very important task.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing, really. I mean, disinformation's always been there. It's always been that. It's just that the channels for media are so huge and global now that it goes.
Excuse me, could I rephrase the question?
Yeah.
When you hear disinformation, a lie that is spreading worldwide in your area, what do you do? How do you tackle it? How do you make sure that people get it right?
Well, I think the one thing you need to do is you need to call it out and you put things out. But you have to be aware that your network, your audience is probably not going to reach to those audiences that are creating the disinformation.
To get to them.
Yeah, so if you put it on your social media and you say, then almost all the people that follow you are things that probably agree that disinformation is bad. So you're not getting to the heart of the problem. So I think one of the things that we need to... So the media is really important in this. So I think... when we had the event here a few years ago, we had a presentation for Fiona Fox, who started the Science Media Centre in the UK, which is at Wellcome Trust now. And science media centres are really useful. And I'm trying to start one in Jordan. There's only about a handful around the world. And they're places where journalists can come to and say, look, I'm interested in this topic, and I need an expert. If they just go out and Google, they'll find all sorts of strange people who will say, yes, I'm an expert, and they're quite happy to talk about it. It's very confusing, but in particular for disinformation elements. And science media centers can say, look, here's a set of people who we have verified as an academy that are experts in this area. Even to the point, and we mentioned about post notes, even the point of maybe putting things out beforehand or straight afterwards, saying, here are quotes from scientists talking about this particular issue. Mm-hmm. And then most journalists will then use that as a starting point for their kind of view. So misinformation, misinformation is just slightly confused information. Disinformation, deliberate, manufactured uncertainty is much more of a fundamental problem. If any issue starts to get importance in the public, important for money, this manufactured uncertainty will come in. Whether it's big pharma, whether it's climate change, whether it's defense systems and kind of military things, all of that will kick in. So there it's a case of the science has been very, very clear and having avenues to reach out.
It's sorry to point out that this center has quite strict rules in Great Britain, for example, concerning funding. There is, I do believe, Otta will know 5% from one company, if I'm not mistaken. Just 5% of the budget can be given by one single entity to make sure that they are still impartial, that they are not financed by a huge pile of money from one side. So they could be, confused with some lobbyist or something else. We do not have something like this in the Czech Republic.
And we don't have it in the Arab world, which I think is, I'm interested in that area as well, and I think there's large parts of the world that does not have it. It tends to be the Anglophone countries, so Australia, New Zealand's got one. There's ones, I think, in Malaysia and Spain, but it's mainly the UK ones and the US through the National Academy of Science as well.
As a PRist, how should I persuade my often very humble colleagues to promote themselves and their work?
Well, I kind of think of myself as a PRist now as well, so public relations.
Really?
Yeah, well, so if you read the academic literature on science communication, it makes it very clear this is not marketing. Marketing is toothpaste. We do science. We're above all that. And we shouldn't fall into the tricks and devices of pure marketing. But actually, marketing is the interface between an organization and its customer base. So take that into the academic world. It's the interaction between the academics, who's arguably the power base behind the universities, etc., and the public who's this is a public university in Karlova, paying for all of this. So marketing is the science of communication. And I think that, one thing is embracing your PR person a little bit more, because not only are they trying to raise the profile of your work and of your institution, but they have also the skill sets that can help you do that. But often, the PR person appears at a time it's tricky, you're busy with something like that, and you just see it as the university wants something. It's extractive, Universities are incredibly extractive places. Academia is an extractive industry. And so you're feeling as if you're doing it. So there has to be a sense of benefit in return to you as an individual. Why am I going to spend time with this person? How is it going to benefit me, my career, etc.? And I think just working that out within a university or a department, or even an individual's head, is really quite important. If people don't see the benefit of it, why should they do it? That's the thing.
One maybe tip, after the interview, ask his or her, meaning the scientist's grandmother, to give feedback. No feedback is better than when the grandma says, that's good. Johnny, you are so handsome. It's the best feedback to persuade the scientist to go on TV for the second, third, and fourth time.
Yeah, that's
Grandmas
great.
are the most powerful ones. Please go ahead. We will. Please go for it.
Okay. Hi, Václav Pavlík from Astronomical Institute of the Academy of Sciences. My question is, when you talk to someone who is really strongly opinionated and denounces science, let's say in the questions of climate change or vaccinations or shape of the Earth, how do you keep communicating and not arguing?
I think there's two bits there. At one point, there's a law of diminishing returns. So if someone's, you do these segmentation of the public. Climate change is a really good one. So those who think climate change, there's a thing called the 6 Americas, if you check up, and it's the percentage in different categories. So across here, it's about whether you are worried by it, you think it's really genuine, and right across here, you think it's a scam. The amount is, although the numbers in that one have increased so that it's now 30 or so % think it's really, really important in that Americas, the scam law has stayed more or less at 10%. And that's because they're built into their preset ideology of how the world should work. So in that sense, it's kind of pointless to try to discuss and argue with them. You're never going to change them. What is quite useful is it refines your arguments. So they'll say things, and although you're not going to change them, it changes you. You start to think, how would I answer that point? When I answer it here, he's not going to change. But actually, someone else who was in the middle and asked that question, then they might kind of do it. So I think there's that actually there are some people it's just not worth spending the energy on because you're never going to shift it. But I think I did a program on climate change. I learned more about climate change from skeptics saying, why are the planets warming? Venus is warming and Mars warming. What's that got to do with cars? And I'd go, I don't know. And you check it up. So there is within the problem with consensus in science is that it doesn't cause us to question things very much, and those questions comes from the outside. Mm-hmm. So what's really good about those kind of opinionated people is you can say they could ask a question, and you can say, "That's interesting. Why do you think that? What is it that have you read something? No, I've read it. No, my friend." And he's an astrophysicist, whatever it is, you can start to unpack why it is that someone's got that view. I think what we tend to do is we tend to rush in and go, oh, no, there was a study published in Science and it said, and we hit them with the science. And of course, that's way beyond their comfort zone or way beyond their, they don't know who that group is or something. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that business about using it as we spend so much time in our echo chamber that having moments where someone confronts us with such shocking comments that we go, how can you think that? And so that taking those opportunities to dig a little bit, where does this come from, You probably won't get to a bridging ground, but that's okay in the long-term process of you being a communicator, I think.
People aren't even getting the most very basic things. That's your quote. And Iain loves to use the so-called Oxford scale.
Oh, yeah.
The Oxford scale asking people, for example, questions like, the earliest humans lived at the same time as the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
You can guess how many people, what the percentage of those who knew what was the truth and what was wrong, was
I think
in
40%,
this scale.
40%, as I recall, 40% said it was, I've not got my glasses on, but yeah.
Last one.
Yeah.
True, 32, 46% false.
But if you add up the ones who thought it was true, the dinosaurs lived at the same time as people, with the ones who didn't know, it's more than 50%. So the majority of people didn't know this. And that's interesting. Why is that the case? Some of the other ones are funny, though. There was like, so one of them said, so here's a question for you. The oxygen that we breathe comes from plants, true or false? Who thinks that's true? Oxygen that we breathe comes from plants.
Yes, this is an actual vote.
One of the ones.
This is an actual vote.
So who thinks it's true? Who would say it's false? So why is it false? Why is it false?
Well, the source of oxygen was from the space itself. The plant didn't create the oxygen.
Partly that, yeah. There's something else as well. There's other sources of oxygen. A third of the oxygen comes from the oceans, from creatures photosynthesizing in the oceans. So you can say it's not true, but you don't know if you're doing it because you have no idea that plants produce oxygen, which is that literacy thing. Or you could be uber clever and know the thing and you're saying it's not true because actually there's something more complicated. So this is why facts and these kind of surveys are not very useful, is you're not really sure why it is people have got that view.
We'll be talking about sociology in a bit, so...
Yeah, no. So I sometimes say I went into geology because I didn't like all that human stuff, but actually I've realized what a terrible mistake I've made. And now all my researchers that I work with are now in the social sciences, so no, great.
We have 2 more minutes, and you are not a politician, so I will give you 4 answers, 4 questions, and I do expect to hear
4 questions. Okay.
4 answers. Yeah, are you ready?
Yeah.
Do you have any advice, a story, how to communicate to public the necessity of using animals in experiments?
Oh, that's a really tricky one, and it's not my area. I think it would be stories around the power of the drugs and the medical interventions for their human stories. And there'll still be a minority of people who would be saying, it doesn't matter, all of that, because it's still fundamentally wrong. But I think that would be the way, stories of the power to change people's lives to the better.
Where is the line between storytelling and misleading?
Well, that's that point about the ethical dimension. And I think you probably know it yourself when you're pushing it, the boundaries. I mean, there's a little bit where you're selling your research and you're knowing, actually, that's not quite right, but I'm hoping I'm going to get my money. You kind of know when you're stepping close to that line or stepping over it. But I think it's acknowledging that we are in the persuasion business. We are trying to affect behavioural change, which is the most difficult thing to accommodate.
What is your opinion on geoengineering to tackle the climate change? Is there some single geoengineering idea you would bet on?
I think it's a really difficult space, and I think there's a whole bunch of technical people itching to experiment with the atmosphere and the oceans, etc. And the lack of reaction and response in society and political circles is making that more and more likely. I think if you carbon capture storage, which is the permanent disposal of CO2 in the subsurface, some people say that's geoengineering, other people say it's permanent net zero. So I think there's things that are more tried and tested, but the idea of going with something that's not tried and tested at scale is absolutely frightening. So,
do you have any tips how to communicate with people who are already enthusiastic in science, for example, talented children or amateur astronomers?
Well, I think they're the easy ones, and I think it's just creating those opportunities to inspire. They'll be the ones who will come in and be inspiring. And I think they're not the problem ones, because we've always had them. I think it's reaching out the tail of the recruitment and admissions into those places that's more marginalised that we don't get. I think that's where science communication needs to go, I think.
So with these people, you can just mess it up.
Yeah, I mean, look at you. You mentioned Thingy from Big Bang Theory.
Sheldon Cooper.
Sheldon is the biggest advert for geology because he slags us off so much. And he picks up a geology book and says, "Have you guys had a children's party?" You know, the geology is the Kardashians of science. They're not real celebrities. You know, but he's our best. Advert for it. So.
Sheldon Cooper and Iain Stewart.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much. Thank you.